Before I came to the Christian country, my religion was the religion of Muhammad, the apostle of God. May God have mercy upon him and give him peace. I walked to mosque before daybreak, washed my face and head and hands and feet. I prayed at noon. I prayed in the afternoon, prayed at sunset, and prayed in the evening. I gave alms every year, gold, silver, seeds, cattle, sheep, goats, rice, wheat, and barley. I gave tithes of all of the above named things. I reside in this our country by reason of great necessity. Wicked men took me by violence and sold me to the Christians. We sailed a month and a half on the Great Sea to the place called Charleston in the Christian land. I fell into the hands of a small, weak, and wicked man who feared not God at all, nor did he read the gospel at all, nor did he pray. I was afraid to remain with a man so depraved and who committed so many crimes, and I ran away. Those are the translated words of Omar ibn Said, born in present-day Senegal. He was captured and enslaved in South Carolina, where he experienced and witnessed the horrors of bondage. He eventually escaped and ended up in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Today, we will learn more about his story and the cultural and spiritual legacy he has left us. Good afternoon. My name is Crystal Regan, Chief Education Officer of the North Carolina Museum of History. We are glad to partner with Carolina K-12 Humanities, and we are elated to join you today for what we fully expect to be an enlightening session of sharing and learning. Here at the museum, we are in the process of adding new materials for teacher and student consumption, and we are working on changes and improvements to make content more user-friendly and accessible. So stay tuned and check in often. We look forward to building partnerships with you, and I hope that you look to us as we continue to find creative and innovative ways to share the history of our great state. Thank you.
Hello all, and welcome to this evening's webinar on Omar ibn Said, Challenging Misconceptions of Slavery. My name is Emma Harver, and I'm the Director of Outreach for the Duke UNC Consortium for Middle East Studies. We thank you for choosing to spend your time with us this evening for a discussion of such an important topic. I'd like to thank the sponsors of tonight's webinar, the North Carolina Museum of History and Carolina K-12 for inviting our center, the Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies, to be a part of this program. We also thank the Bright Mayer Foundation for funding this entire Teaching Hard History series. In today's webinar, we will hear 4 scholars present on the incredible life, work, and resistance of Omar ibn Said, as well as the often overlooked role of Muslims in antebellum America. The format of today's webinar will be as follows. Each panelist will give a 15-minute presentation, followed by a brief Q&A on their presentation, as a way to break up the presentations. If you have questions for each speaker as they are presenting, please go ahead and type them in the Q&A box. And at the end of all presentations, we hope to have time for more general Q&A. So as you think of questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A box throughout tonight's webinar. I am thrilled to introduce our first panelist, Naomi Feast. Naomi is a local scholar from Raleigh, North Carolina, who has spent many years researching and designing historical and cultural presentations for use in schools, festivals, and for historical events. She holds a Master's of Arts in Liberal Studies from Duke University and has recently retired from Durham Technical Community College and has enjoyed continuing her scholarship on special history projects that have always been pushed to the background before retirement. So with that, thank you so much, Naomi, for being here.
Thank you, Emma. I always like to start with God's name, the merciful benefactor, merciful redeemer. I thank you for inviting me. I want to thank the Museum of History and the Middle Eastern Studies Department. And most important, I want to thank you, the participants, for joining us to discuss this very important topic, Muslims in Antebellum America. I reviewed some questions that you submitted, and I have given a resource list to Emma that I think, should you get that, you will be able to find answers to some of your questions. So let me start. I was asked to give an overview of Muslims in antebellum America. I chose to focus on enslaved African Muslims as I think that their experience will mirror much of Omar ibn Said's experience. I took a look at the term antebellum. That's a period that is, according to the definition, a period occurring or existing before a particular war, especially the American Civil War. So usually we think of that period as late 18th century, as the antebellum period is from the early 18th century up to the Civil War. Next slide, please. Next slide, okay. So if you look at the slide there, you'll see a map, and that map shows the route of one Estevanico. Now, Estevanico is thought to be the first Muslim to arrive in North America around 1527. History reports that he was likely a Muslim, raised as a Muslim, but was required to convert to Catholicism because at that time, during his travels, Spain had a ban on Muslims. So this concept of a Muslim ban is not the first. Next slide, please. While early European settlers arrived in this new land hoping for prosperity, they were fleeing, escaping poverty and persecution because they were Protestants. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So just one back, please. While they were fleeing, coming to this new area to start a new life, seeking prosperity, African Muslims arrived on slave ships, unaware of their fate. Scholars estimate that between 15 to 25% and maybe even up to 30% of those enslaved were Muslims. Next slide, please. So who were these Muslims and where did they come from? So this map gives us a good idea of the regions of West Africa that had the most slaves captured and sent to this area. If you look, you see a number of names, areas, Fulani, it's all over the map. Fulani, there, I counted about 9. So they came from places, the Fulani area, they were Mandingo and from Wolof. They were Wolof, Fulani and Mandingo, but they came from Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Mali, Ghana, and even over as far as Nigeria, because you can see where it says Hausa. So that was in the Nigeria area. Next slide, please. What did they bring with them? They brought a knowledge of themselves. They knew who they were. They knew their names. They knew their faith, their language, traditions, etc. And they fought very hard to hold on to their traditions, their name, etc. Classic example, Kunta Kinte. If you saw the documentary Roots, you will remember how hard he fought to hold on to his name. So not only did they bring a knowledge of themselves or self-awareness, they brought universal skills or universal knowledge or values, universal values around God consciousness, family, justice, fairness, freedom. They brought skills. Many were agriculturalists. There were those who were skilled in growing rice, and that was particularly important to those who were in the South Carolina, Georgia Sea Islands, and even North Carolina. In North Carolina, there was a plantation, Somerset Plantation, that did grow rice, but not to the extent that the plantations in South Carolina, Georgia, around the Sea Islands. They also brought literacies and scholarship skills. They were intellectually competent. Of course, they spoke many languages, and because of their intellect, they were often given jobs that would not be like those jobs of the regular enslaved African in the field. They brought military skills. Most of them were captured and were prisoners of war. That's how they ended up in the transatlantic slave trade. Next slide, please. What was life like in the 18th and 19th century antebellum America? During that time, small farmers who came to the area, or these were settlers who came, they were small farmers eking out their living beside indentured servants who could have been or were Africans, Europeans, and sometimes Native Americans. Larger plantations, of course, needed more labor. And we found an example of that at Somerset Plantation. Next slide, please. History shows us that West Africans were brought directly from the coast of West Africa to Somerset Plantation. Records show that there were 80 West Africans who were delivered directly to Somerset Plantation in 1786. Their job was to clear the land and dig canals that were 6 miles long, 20 feet deep. And this was the example of the work that was required of those who ended up at Somerset Plantation, owned by the Collins family. Next slide, please. I would encourage you to visit Somerset Plantation because you will be able to see how close these ships were able to dock. They would come in through an inlet and dock right in the backyard of Somerset Plantation. So you can see how easy it was to bring in those West African Muslims and who were enslaved. Next slide, please. Do you know their names? Who were some of these Muslims in antebellum America? There are a list of names here: Bilali Muhammad, Salih Bilali, Abdul Rahman Ibrahimi. Of course, we know Omar ibn Said's name. It's not here, but you'll hear about him later. Yusuf bin Ali. There are a number of names given. These were all Muslim men, women, and children. So I ask that you please remember their names or say their names more often in your classes when you discuss antebellum American history. And I would encourage you to get a book entitled Muslims in America by Amir Muhammad. That book is listed with the resource material that I've given to Emma. Next slide, please. Okay, yes. This is another piece of evidence of Muslims living in antebellum America. It's a Runaway ad. And that ad, I'll share with you well, this is just a picture, but the ad that was shown earlier, or that I was able to find, says this: Runaway on John's Island, fellow Sambo and wench Fatima from Guinea country, suspected of being harbored in James Island. And this was an ad that came out in Charleston, South Carolina, July 17, 1786. So those names indicate to us those people were likely Muslim. Fatima and Sambo, which is a version of the name Musa. Next slide, please. Another piece of evidence shows that Muslims were actually part of this antebellum America. We see an ad for slaves for sale. And the ad says, prime Windward Coast slaves, the sale of the Heart Oaks cargo, consisting of 300 prime Windward Coast slaves of the Mandingo and Fula nations, will commence tomorrow. So we know these must surely have been Muslims who were caught up in this slave trade. Next slide, please. Now, during the antebellum period, there was a time, and I'm fast forward a bit in time. There was a time, or came the time, when the settlers um, had settled in, and they now began to be angered and were disturbed by laws that were being passed in England. Laws like the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, a Quartering Act, and they decided it was time to be independent of England, and they cried, "Give me liberty or give me death." This rallying cry was not ignored by those who were enslaved. They began to plan and come up with their own plans to address this issue of slavery and also to find ways to seek freedom. Next slide, please. Well, you're at the right place. Okay, thank you. Settlers expressed concerns about having enslaved Muslims living among them. Virginia had passed a law very similar to a law that was passed by Spain, but they passed a law in 1682. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. We're going to skip this one. Next slide. Thank you. The law was passed to address those fears. It was passed in 1682. It was called the Christian Parentage Law, the Virginia Slave Act. This was a code that said neither Negro, Moor, mulatto, or Indian would escape enslavement if at the time of their purchase, their parents were not from a Christian country. So we know, if you look at that map, majority of those who were enslaved and brought into the area were not from a Christian country. Therefore, they were doomed to be enslaved. That was Virginia and other states passed laws regarding what they call slave codes. Next slide, please. Okay, so Muslims tried to maintain their Islamic faith, especially their prayers and their dietary laws. And if you look through the material that we have on that list, you will read the stories of those Muslims, such as Bilal Muhammad, how they tried to hold the community together. They tried to maintain their prayers and dietary laws, although it's very difficult. They always had hope for a better life and for freedom. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide, please. What we have here is a picture of two enslaved Muslims who were fought in American wars. You have at the bottom, I'm sorry, to your left, you have Muhammad Ali bin Said, also known as Nicholas Said. He fought in the Civil War. To the right, you see Salim Poor. He fought in the American Revolution. So these are names of people that you can include in your discussion as you teach your students. Next slide, please. Now, as this new nation developed, of course, they had to come up with laws and a way to govern themselves. So we are moving now past the American Revolution and at the point of establishing or putting together a government. When it was time to confirm or to ratify the United States Constitution, we see in the left slide a highway marker that is there to note a historic event, the Constitutional Convention of 1788. The delegates at this convention here in North Carolina, they discussed and debated whether Muslims could be citizens or maybe even the president. So this was a very fierce debate that took place between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And you can see on the right, the picture of a document showing that indicates proceedings and the debates of that convention in North Carolina. So I would encourage you to take a look at that if you can, get a copy of that and see the types of questions and the types of discussions that went on in that debate. Next slide, please. Now, early American leaders as we believe, were possibly influenced by Islam. And I have Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. I would encourage you to also download, there is no charge, download Muslims and the Making of America. It was written by Precious Rashida Muhammad, who is a scholar. It was written in 2013 and published by the American Public Affairs Council. And it gives a very good detailed discussion on how some of the early American leaders, called the Founding Fathers, were possibly influenced by Islam. As one point that she makes, that Thomas Jefferson purchased the Holy Quran in 1765 and began teaching himself Arabic. And it points out how, Ms. Muhammad points out how she believes this influenced his thinking when he wrote in 1776, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, because it does align with concepts and beliefs that's found in the Holy Quran. Next slide, please. So we ask, could these enslaved Muslims have imagined that their descendants would embrace and reconnect to their lost Islamic heritage and establish masajids across not only North Carolina, but across the country? The first, the picture on your top left is a picture of Masjid Omar ibn Said, located in Fayetteville, North Carolina. The picture to the right of it, top right, is a picture, it's actually a rendition of Masjid Bilal in Los Angeles, California. The bottom picture is a picture of Masjid Waterfuddin Muhammad, located in Houston, Texas. These are just a few examples of how Islam has been embraced by those who are descendants of the enslaved African Muslims. Now, of course, we have no real way of knowing if our ancestors were actually Muslim, but Dr. C. Eric Lincoln points out in one of his books that he believes that African Americans have been attracted to the religion of Islam because they have a genetic memory of the life, or their Muslim life, prior to being brought to this country. That there's a genetic memory that's clocked in that causes them to migrate or have this interest in Islam as a religion. So if you study biology and genetics, perhaps you can understand that concept. Next slide, please. Could those enslaved African Muslims have imagined that the former Minnesota U.S. Representative Keith Ellison, a descendant of ex-slaves, would serve in the U.S. House of Representatives and use Thomas Jefferson's Quran in the swearing-in ceremony? Next slide, please. Could they have imagined that America's Imam W. Muhammad, son of the late Honorable Elijah Muhammad and Clara Evans Muhammad, would speak to a gathering of 100,000 people at the Vatican in the presence of Pope John Paul II, the Dalai Lama in 1999, and also speak or attend the Jubilean Interfaith Conference for World Peace that was held in Israel, and the World Conference on Religions for Peace that was held in Amman, Jordan. And he became, or he was elected, the WCRP International President from the United States. Next slide, please. In conclusion, without doubt, Muslims of African ancestry have been part of the geographic territory that we call the United States since its beginning, or before its beginning, and throughout the antebellum period. Historical evidence suggests that Muslims will continue to contribute to the growth and development of this nation as circumstances push America to strive to become a more perfect union by embracing the beauty of the oneness of humanity. Thank you.
Well, thank thank you so much, Naomi, for that very interesting presentation on Muslims in antebellum America. We have time for just a couple of brief questions, and I see questions coming in through the Q&A box, and we'll have time at the end to get to more of your questions. But just too briefly, Naomi, can you say where is Somerset Plantation that you mentioned in your presentation?
Somerset is in Washington County, North Carolina, near a town called Creswell. I have visited there and I took my children there. It's a beautiful site, I mean, physically. But to think of the work that was involved to become what it became, thinking of those canals that had to be cleared, dug out, you know, imagining all of the possible disease-infected microbes that were probably in that swampy area, and snakes and what have you. You know, it's just the horror of it all can be overwhelming just to think of that. But that is what happened at Somerset Plantation, and probably many others. You could probably find stories similar, but it's in North Carolina, Washington County.
Thank you for locating that for us, Naomi. And just one more question for you before we move on to our next presentation is regarding the kinds of dietary restrictions and practices that enslaved Muslims were maintaining. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? You know, did they fast for Ramadan? Is there any evidence of that?
Yeah, there is evidence, and I've read a few stories of those Muslims who tried to maintain their fast and pray. Now, although they were not able to, I think there was a story of one man, he would go into the woods to pray, and there was a child that would always come and taunt him, throw rocks at him while he made his prayers. Of course, it was very difficult to maintain dietary laws, but there's also an account of one who would not drink alcohol. One of the enslavers spoke of how he could not get this particular individual to drink alcohol. So they did try to maintain, but of course it was difficult. It was they really didn't have lots of choices, but they did the best they could. And that's why it's such, I won't say a miracle, but it's such an astonishing thing to see how many African Americans have reconnected to their Islamic heritage and have embraced Islam and made it a way of life for themselves, and then have established places of worship. So I don't imagine that those enslaved Muslims would have thought, but surely they prayed for their progeny and for a better life, that they would have a better life than they had.
Well, thank you, Naomi. That's a great place to leave it. And I know there are a lot of questions coming in, and we'll have the chance to have further discussion at the end of our webinar. So thank you, Naomi.
Sure, thank you.
I will go ahead and introduce our next panelist, who is Dr. Carl Ernst. Dr. Carl Ernst is the Keenan Distinguished Professor of Islamic Studies in the Department of Religious Studies at UNC Chapel Hill, and he's also the co-director of our Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies. Dr. Ernst, together with Dr. Mbailo at Duke University, is currently working on a really exciting project related to Omar ibn Said, and is currently editing what may be the first comprehensive transcription and translation project of 15 existing documents written in Sayyid by Arabic. And so through his current research, Carl has become quite the expert on Omar, and through his Arabic skills and theological knowledge has been able to bring really great and interesting new insights into his work in life. So Carl, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this event, and welcome all the participants. And I hope you will find much to take away that will help you in your work, which is so important to our state. Yes, with Mbailo, my good friend and colleague at Duke, two of us have been working for almost 2 years on the first ever critical edition of all of the writings of some Omar ibn Said. And incidentally, Emma, we now have discovered 2 more. There's 17 documents in all. So let me just get my screen shared with you so you can see some of the images I want to share. So you don't have to memorize this list, but this indicates to you the 17 documents that we have discovered and where they are located. They're scattered around and have survived by good fortune in libraries and other collections in different parts of the country. And this is what they look like. They're written in Arabic script in the style of the North African hand, slightly different from today's modern standard Arabic. Some of them have interesting diagrams, which we believe have talismanic or amulet-like significance. We are now working on, we've established the Arabic text for the very first time. Most of the translations that you have seen have been referring to photographs of the documents. And so people have just announced that they interpret the text in a particular way. But we have decided that this is the basic humanistic task that has to be done. Establish the text in a critical edition, and this is going to be published on an internet archive. This is what our software looks like, which is marking it up in two different ways. We have a diplomatic edition, which means the exact copy of what was written in the manuscript, and then we have the modern standard edition, which is with corrections. The existing texts, unfortunately, have been frequently mistranslated. And the scholars, starting in the 1840s, who attempted to deal with these manuscripts, have frequently said that the writings of Omar ibn Said were unintelligible, that he had a bad knowledge of Arabic, or he'd forgotten too much. And I'm afraid in too many instances, this was excusing the inability of the scholars to read what he had written. Our approach is new in several respects. We're connecting Omar ibn Said to the discipline of Islamic studies. We're doing this in terms of a comprehensive look at all of his writings. We have identified a half a dozen sources of classical Arabic texts on Islamic theology and Sufism that have never been perceived before in Omar's writing. And we've done a literary analysis of the invisible audience he was writing to, because no one in America could understand what he was saying at the time. And this is going to be an important avenue for us to do a more thorough understanding of the role of Arabic and Islam in the US, the role of missionaries in early scholarship, etc. There are some serious questions that these documents raise, because the portraits of Omar ibn Said that we have currently are based, as I said, partly on documents which have not been well translated, but also they've been based on accounts of the enslavers who were from the slaveholding class in North Carolina and the southern United States. And these people may have had conversations with Omar, but what they report is not necessarily what he said, or perhaps it's what they wanted to hear, but there are some interesting conflicts. And the documents raise some serious questions about the credibility of their accounts of his conversion to Christianity. And his autobiography, the largest of the 17 documents, is very unusual because it's the only slave narrative that was written in Arabic, and it may well be the only one that was written by someone who was still in the condition of bondage. All the other slave narratives, as they're called, are written by somebody who, after they have been liberated. And so it's quite extraordinary. Now, you won't have to memorize the names of these Arabic texts that we have been dealing with, but the ones on law and theology and Sufism have not been understood before to be part of his repertoire. But the law and theology texts which he studied were the basic texts that everyone memorized, and they still do in West Africa. The Sufi works that he quotes are the advanced curriculum, and they really change our understanding of his whole background and his entire work. His autobiography needs to be understood as a work that was under revision, because he remarks at the beginning, "I cannot write my life." As someone who was enslaved, he was unable to speak freely. And we've offered a more detailed analysis. I want to give you just one example of how our understanding has changed. He speaks in his autobiography about how James Owen, the enslaver, would supervise the religious education that was being imparted to him in Fayetteville and Wilmington. And he says, he, Jim Owen, with his brother, has me read the gospel. But then he says something which comes out of a text on Islamic theology. Our Lord, our Creator, and our Master, the corrector of our conditions, both now and as an example, as a gift rather than as a constraint to his power. And then he goes on to say, this opened my heart to the way of guidance, to the way of Jesus, the Messiah, to a great light. He's reading the Bible through an Islamic text. In his revision of this passage, a few pages later, he says, General Jim Owen reads the gospel with his wife. He has me read the gospel much. And he quotes again the same theological fragment, God, our Lord, our Creator. And then he adds a new text, which is from an important work on Islamic law and theology, the Mukhtasar of Khalil. And praise God with much praise, he bestows bounty that overflows with goodness. This is really extraordinary. When he's reading the Bible, he's understanding it through the text on Islamic thought that he studied in the academy in Futa Toro. So this is kind of an amazing shift that's going to change our understanding of this. Emma, how are we doing on time?
You have about 8 minutes left, Carl.
So I'd like to go back and tell you one more thing about the text that he's quoting. These are poems written in Arabic. And he quotes them in his first letter of 1819, which is addressed to to Governor John Owen, the brother of James Owen. And he begins by quoting from the passage on the attributes of God from a North African author named Al-Hawdi al-Tilimsani. This is a work that was written in letters of gold ink for the kings of North Africa. It was highly prized. He also quotes a poem on the names of God that is by an author named Dimyati. These were works which were about Sufi practice, meditation, and devotion. And he also gives a pretty stiff sermon quoted from the Andalusian Sufi Abu Madyan, which is quite extraordinary. And I'll quote it for you. He says, "By God, you who are turning gray, what are you waiting for? Have you not considered the fate of those who've gone before you? Either you're crazy or you're a fool. Your beard is white, but your heart is black." This is a kind of stiff prescription that he's offering here. It's the words of a preacher from Andalusia who was practicing the rhetoric of inciting people to seek heaven and to avoid hellfire. The fact that Omar ibn Said presents this verse in a letter addressed to John Owen is pretty significant. Even though he's not using his own words to say this, he's offering a call for repentance and preaching the necessity to seek divine forgiveness. He also frequently quotes verses about the dangers of arrogance and of seeking to amass wealth for yourself to the neglect of others. So in effect, Omar was a kind of a Sufi preacher who was delivering a message to the slave owners of North Carolina that they couldn't understand. And this was a sad lack of the opportunity to really communicate. But what is really important is to realize that this was a scholar of Arabic who knew quite a lot, and his message was not understood at the time. But I think it is desirable for us to make this available in a form that is accessible to the public. And so Imbailo and I are aiming to do that in the very near future. So I'd be happy to take some questions now.
Thank you so much, Carl, for sharing about your project and the many the contributions that you all are making to a better understanding of his life by really analyzing his writings. We have a couple of questions for you. One is about Omar ibn Said's age, and if there's any knowledge about when he was captured and brought to the United States, as well as how long did he live?
From figures that he gives in his autobiography, we can calculate that he was born about 1770. And he seems to have been on board a slave ship that arrived in December of 1807 in Charleston. That was the last year of legal import of slaves into the United States. Then he was put on the block, sold in Charleston shortly afterwards, and then was sold to another owner who was harsh. And at that point, he ran away to Fayetteville and was eventually acquired by General Owen, Governor Owen. So he lived until 1863. He was a 93-year-old man when he died. He never married. He lived a relatively privileged condition in the home of the Owen family. And so he was 37 when he arrived in the US and lived for another over 50 years, actually. Or just about 50 years. Yeah.
Thanks, Carl. And can you mentioned briefly, but can you elaborate a little bit more about the kind of work that he was doing for the Owens? And was this elaborated upon in his autobiography?
No, he said nothing about doing any kind of work. He was very happy. He describes himself as a small man who is not strong and even of weak eyesight. And so he was not really, and he was, even at 37, that was too old for work in the fields or the terrible, digging canals that we heard about a few moments ago. So he had his own cabin. He had a cook. He was treated as a member of the family. He was brought out on occasions when visitors were there, and they'd say, "Omar, would you write that funny Arabic stuff that you do?" And so a lot of the documents that we have were presumably produced in such a manner. But there were people who were relatively privileged among those who were enslaved. Some scholars have called them slave aristocrats. They came to an understanding with the people who were their enslavers. And Omar has positive words to say about the Owen family because, as he puts it, they feed me with what they eat and they clothe me with what they wear.
Thanks, Carl. I have two questions that I'll tie together. And again, I see so many great questions coming in, and hopefully we'll have time to address more of these at the end. These are related. Is there knowledge about where his grave is located? And are there any records of any of his descendants living in North Carolina or elsewhere?
Well, he never married, as I said, and he had no children, and so there's no descendants. He was with the Owen family. They moved to Wilmington in 1836. But they moved back around 1860 to Bladen County. And he was buried with the Owen family. And so his grave is marked. You can actually find it on the internet if you do the right search. But the members of the Owen family, their bodies were transported to Wilmington and reburied in a different cemetery. His headstone was removed at some point. I think somebody walked off with it. So it's not marked, but it's within a brick enclosure, according to the photograph. I haven't been there myself, but that's where it is. So he had a long life with the Owen family.
Well, thank you again so much for sharing your research with us and your findings, some of your findings, and we will look forward to sharing more about your project as more becomes published with all of the attendees.
Absolutely, yeah. We hope to make some resources available on the internet, and we're very keenly appreciative of the work that all of you are doing. So.
Well, thank you so much, Carl. And with that, I'd like to move on to introducing our next panelist, Yasmin Floden Ali. Yasmin is an Islamic Studies PhD student in the Department of Religious Studies at UNC Chapel Hill, and her research focuses on the history of Muslims, race, and racialization in the United States. Before coming to UNC Chapel Hill, Yasmin obtained her bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a Master of Theological Studies degree from Harvard Divinity School. She has a background in interfaith and educational equity work, and Yasmin has done a lot of work with Dr. Ernst on his project and translating Omar ibn Said's writings. So Yasmin, thank you so much for being here, and I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you so much for having me. Can you make me co-host, Emma, so I can share the PowerPoint?
I might be able to, or Christy, if you could work on that as well.
Anyone would be perfect. Awesome, thank you so much. Can everyone see that? Or Emma, can you see that?
Yeah, thanks, Yasmin.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here today. This project is really close to my heart. I took the first version of Carl's class in Sayyid last spring, and I've been really grateful to work with him as one of his research assistants. And as Emma said, I work on the history of race and Muslims in the US, so definitely really pertinent. And I'm really grateful that all of you are here today. We're really hoping that through you, this history can become a little bit more widely known and accessible. So I'm going to focus today not on Sayyid's own work, which is super interesting and exciting and really great research that Dr. Ernst is doing, but research that he definitely can speak best to. I'm going to focus instead on the way that Sayyid was portrayed during his lifetime and shortly after his death through examining some newspaper articles and other artifacts. And while we're going through these together, I want to sort of think collectively about how archives come to be constructed and what our relationship and responsibility is to those archives. I'm particularly thinking about the wonderful students that you all work with, how they can be thoughtful when they're sort of learning to identify and work with primary sources. So Sayyid died in 1864, just a year before the end of the Civil War, but he was still frequently written about in the decades after his death, which I think is super telling. And having students analyze newspaper articles written about Sayyid between 1825 and 1925 should be able to help them identify shifts in language that were used to justify slavery pre and post Civil War. And I think that's really key there, that unfortunately students will be able to see kind of in real time how much the lost cause narrative is really vouched for up to like 5 decades, honestly, after the end of the Civil War. It's pretty alarming, and how Sayyid continues to be sort of used in sort of justification of that cause. So the article that I have up here to the left, which actually should all have gone to your emails as part of a PDF that you can show students, was published in 1825, first by the Christian Advocate, which is a newspaper that comes out of Philadelphia, and then by the Columbian Star, which is a newspaper that comes out of Washington, D.C. And I think that's something really fun to show students and really interesting, that unfortunately copying and pasting between news sources is not a new phenomenon, something that's been happening for a really long time. And particularly in the age before social media and Google, really no one would be the wiser if you just took a newspaper from a different newspaper and published it in a different locale. I think this is also important because it shows that there was an investment in sort of justifying the institution of slavery outside of the American South, and there was an interest in learning about people who were enslaved all over the country. So there are a lot of physical descriptions of Sayyid's body in these articles. For example, the Christian Advocate article to the left states, "His dignified deportment showed him to be of a superior caste. His humility, that of a peaceful subject, not a despot. In his person, he is well formed, of a middle size, small hands and feet, erect in deportment." And there's a lot of really interesting language here that I think students can analyze and kind of clue into. The despot is definitely a reference, I think, to this kind of idea of the Orient, the sort of notion that, you know, as someone who was Muslim, he might have been tied to this idea of being despotic, but he's not a despot, don't worry about it. And there's also this really alarming but interesting language about him being physically frail and that being a justification for why he's not working in the fields. And the kind of implication there is that there are bodies that are meant to labor, there are bodies that are meant to work. It's a very biological understanding of race, and a very biological understanding of race that's being used to kind of justify slavery as an institution. A lot of these articles also focus on Sayyid's literacy. So the article to the right, which was published in the Wilmington Chronicle in 1847, says with confidence, "You will perceive that the penmanship is bold and handsome." And you'll see this kind of language a lot in these articles, and it's really interesting because most of the folks who are writing these articles have literally no background whatsoever. They don't know anything about Arabic, but they just kind of think that the penmanship is pretty, and they kind of feel qualified to remark on how good or not good Sayyid is as a writer. And as someone who's tried to read Sayyid's work, I can say that it's not always the easiest. You know, God forbid anyone should ever find my writing 50 or 100 years from now. It's not a knock, it's just handwriting, but it's not necessarily like beautiful calligraphy or anything. So it's interesting that they feel empowered to make these kind of judgments. The North Carolina University magazine also writes about Sayyid's imprisonment. "The strange characters, so elegantly and correctly written by a runaway slave, soon attracted attention." And this is a really common motif throughout all of these stories, or rather kind of a common anecdote. So the story of Sayyid being imprisoned in Fayetteville here in North Carolina is something that really captured the public imagination, this idea of someone kind of writing in a language that no one could understand on his prison walls. really made people interested. And it is kind of beautiful, I think, in a sort of tragic way to think about what he might have written and whether, in fact, he sort of saw some fruition of pleas that he was making to be let out of the jail. And this kind of ties into a point that I think would be interesting to make to students, that literacy in this time period was really closely correlated with intelligence. So there's a really wonderful book called Servants of Allah by Sylvian Diouf, which I think it would be accessible for high school students as well. And she writes about how the movement for mass literacy only started in the 19th century in Europe. And so the literacy of enslaved Muslims sort of becomes a problem that has to be solved in terms of American conceptions of race and a kind of very black-white, literally speaking, binary conception of race. And so literacy becomes almost a racializing characteristic that makes enslaved Muslims exceptional in this time period. And reports of Sayyid use language to sort of downplay or dismiss his Africanness. So the idea that he's able to write, it becomes a problem and he can't really be African. He's supposed to sort of instead be seen as Arab. And so you'll see a lot of stories about him being an Arab by birth of royal blood, which is interesting because in the Wilmington Chronicle article, for example, that language is used. But in the same article, there are quotes from the Owen children who obviously grew up with Sayyid in the house who say, you know, he was from West Africa, and they even know the specifics of he was from the Futa tribe. He was from the contemporary Senegal, Gambia region. But there's this idea of having to kind of like justify how someone who could read and write could also be enslaved. But this exceptionality has its limits. So returning to the Christian Advocate article to the left, even though there's this language about Sayyid's frame kind of being delicate, there's also a quote that says, his complexion and hair, as well as the form of the head, are distinctly of the African character. And this kind of comes back to this interesting tug and pull in this time period of articles that were written during Sayyid's life, where ultimately his story is being used to justify slavery. So yes, he's seen as exceptional. Yes, he's seen as potentially differently African or not fully African, but still there's this kind of need to sort of show that him being enslaved is ultimately for the good. And the way these articles do that is by talking about his alleged conversion to Christianity, which I'm sure Carl talked to you about in detail, and which I personally just don't think that he converted in the way that we contemporarily think about conversion, as a very like clear, distinctive shift. So the Christian Advocate article, for example, ends with a poem about being delivered by Jesus Christ and draws a kind of really direct parallel between God or Christ as a master over people and the slave master as kind of being parallel in the role to Christ. So pretty rough stuff, but really interesting, just in terms of thinking about Christianity being used here as a kind of justification for slavery, even as someone who's being painted as an exceptional person for an enslaved person. Here we've got an article that was published in 1854 by the North Carolina University Magazine at UNC. And it was picked up by some local papers, so you can see it was kind of printed verbatim. And I wanted to draw your attention to this article mainly because of the stark contrast between articles published about Sayyid pre and post-Civil War. So this article written pre-Civil War begins, the town of Wilmington, though of much commercial importance to the good state of North Carolina, cannot boast of many notable personages and is woefully destitute of lions. So basically, this is a boring place. Here's one kind of interesting story from this relatively boring place. And you'll see that's markedly different than the language that we're going to get post-Civil War. So an article published in 1884, about 2 decades after the end of the Civil War and Sayyid's death, starts off by describing the Owen plantation in the most flowery language imaginable. So it reads, in the rear of the house were miles of aromatic, health-bearing pine forests, whose dark forms this season of year were covered with a profusion of the fragrant yellow jasmine, which they spell jessamine. So not surprisingly, this article is highly attuned to and defensive of anti-slavery narratives, claiming that, you know, the readers of Uncle Tom's Cabin will not understand these narratives, that sort of thing. And I think a really interesting shift that you can see here that we should highlight for students is kind of the way that the author changes language that's different than the previous articles. So for example, the author is really blatantly imaginative in describing Sayyid's physical features. He writes, his hair was straight, his features and form were as perfect as those of an Apollo Belvedere. So this comparison of Sayyid to a statue of a Greek god sort of signifies a marked contrast with earlier descriptions. Post-Civil War, there's no longer a need to preserve slavery or talk about its moral goodness, or there's no more mention of Christianity. The focus is more on celebrating and mourning slavery's legacy in really fantastical terms. So we see kind of like a lost cause or Gone with the Wind narrative being propagated here, and Sayyid being kind of used for those narratives. And the article continues, really kind of being really blatant about its purpose. The purpose of this paper is not to commemorate the genial hospitality, the high social position, and varied virtues of the deservedly distinguished gentleman. So in other words, even though this is an article allegedly about Sayyid, really it's about the Owens, and really it's about people with access to power, the sort of slave owning class of North Carolina who have lost that power and are trying to kind of rewrite history or write history in a way that is kind to them, which is why they're still talking about Sayyid like decades after his death. And the Wilmington Messenger article on the right, I thought I'd include because it has a really sort of bizarre but poignant scene. This one was published in 1905, so again, pretty far after the end of the Civil War, pretty far after Sayyid's death. And the author recounts that 25 years ago, he and his friends went for a moonlight picnic to Owen Hill, and they saw Sayyid's ghost, like in the middle of the night, and they saw the ghost of one of the Owen children. I think there's something really beautiful, if strange, about this sort of vignette, because it kind of shows, I think, the way that the archives continue to haunt us, the way that we continue to grapple, even if not explicitly, with this kind of legacy of trauma. And when we don't sort of deal with it, how it bubbles to the surface. And I thought that was really interesting. I thought it was also helpful because I think we tend to focus a lot on Sayyid and the talismans, which are so interesting, and kind of like the seemingly magical practices that he employed. But I think personally that the Owens might have seen some value in the objects that he produced. And I think you can see that, you know, there's all sorts of folks who are dealing with these issues in fantastical, or we might say magical, religious, whatever terms you want to use, sort of ways. And I thought that would be a helpful transition into thinking about how we talk to students about archives and how we talk about these newspapers written about Sayyid and how we even talk about Sayyid's own work and how it was preserved into the present. And I think it's really important to emphasize to students, even high school students, that archives exist into the present because they have strategic value to the people who preserve them. So after Sayyid died, the Arabic Bible given to him by the Owens and several of his manuscripts were donated to Davidson College in North Carolina, where they remain today. And that initial donation was made because Davidson was kind of seen as like a Christian college, and these were Christian artifacts, and again, kind of spoke to a benevolent version or narrative about slavery. This photo of Sayyid to the left was one item among many that were donated to the Dorosset family to the University of North Carolina. And when COVID is finally over, you can go see it in person, which is really interesting and powerful to do, so I hope you get a chance to. And it's still housed there. The Dorosset family owned the photo, but on its back is a brief sort of summary written about Sayyid's life by Alfred Moore Waddell, who signed his name. And I've got a transcription for you here of that. You can read it if you'd like. I know it's kind of a lot of text, but I think it's helpful. And I wanted to kind of talk about this other form of archive, so not just newspapers, but also physical artifacts that kind of bear testament to Sayyid having lived in his life, because I think it's really helpful to think about all the ways that he was kind of a part of like North Carolina history and not sort of like separate or anomaly from it. So all of these families, the Owens, the Dorossets, the Waddells, were close friends and part of North Carolina's small political elite slave owning class. So during the 1898 Wilmington race riot, Alfred Moore Waddell led an armed white citizens group enforcing the democratically elected Republican mayor and multiracial city council to resign. It's been called like the only successful coup d'etat in American history. And after the insurrection, Waddell installed himself as mayor of Wilmington, and he held that position until 1905. And as mayor, he sort of reestablished white control of the city and led to resurgence of the Democratic Party. So we have Waddell, who kind of like wrote this little thing on the back. We've got Dorosset, who donated the photo. He was a high-ranking Confederate soldier. We have the Owen brothers, one who was the governor of North Carolina, and then his brother, who owned, you know, was the slave master. And both of them actively worked against abolition. I think it's also really important to emphasize to students that even as we're talking about, you know, Sayyid being more relatively comfortable in the Owens house, especially compared to his first, the first slave owner in Charleston, who was particularly terrible, you know, that he's writing with a really particular audience, and what he's able to say is limited, and the way that we kind of read his archives are important to sort of look at through that lens. So I think kind of telling students that nothing is neutral about our inherited Sayyid's archives, that Sayyid's papers were preserved because they spoke to the interests of this elite class, and that news coverage within Sayyid during his lifetime and his death were also shaped by these interests is really important. Having said that, I think that we can still read in between the lines for other perspectives. We can still use these resources, and that's still really helpful. So for example, the Christian Advocate article that you were sent to and that I started off with has a kind of like short derisive line, which notes that Sayyid was perceived by other enslaved people to be a pray God to the king, which might be evidence that other people who were enslaved that saw Sayyid felt that he had some kind of power and that they communicated with him, that perhaps they like used the talismans that he produced, and that kind of thing I think can be really interesting to read and to note. That Sayyid would frequently sort of paper the backyard of the Owens property with manuscripts, and that kind of like act was viewed in a certain way, I think is really helpful. And lines like this in the archive can kind of give us insight into the way that Sayyid saw himself and that he was seen by others. And so to that end, I've got kind of a handout for you here. And I really hope that you will adapt this as it works best for you, because you are obviously the experts and know a lot more about what works in a high school classroom than I do. But here we've got just kind of like 3 articles. I chose these because I kind of think it'd be helpful to think about, you know, looking at newspaper articles that were written during the time of slavery, towards the end, and then shortly after, to see sort of like how that language and how those narratives shift. And we've got categories here that students can kind of map out after they've done a close reading of all 3 newspapers. So the first category is names used for Sayyid, and we'll see that there's kind of like a shift between Uncle Moreau, as kind of more familial figure, to more like Prince, a more fantastical figure, Prince Moreau. Depending on how much time you have, even the language of Moore or Moreau that was used instead of his name Omar is really interesting to talk about. We have descriptions of religion, descriptions of the body, which again really shift kind of really radically throughout these different time periods, descriptions of literacy, and then ultimately ending with descriptions of slavery as an institution. So I hope this handout is helpful, or even if it's not directly helpful, then you can sort of adapt it in ways that would be helpful for you, and even feel free to choose different newspapers depending on what time periods you're covering. I'm gonna stop there. I know I went a little bit over. And if Emma, if you got any questions for me.
Thank you, Yasmin, for that really great presentation, for sharing your analysis of all of these different primary sources. It's really helpful to see how different language has been used to characterize Sayyid over time and what the implications of that are. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to ask you one question, and it's actually, as you've created this lovely activity for teachers attending this program to use in their classrooms. And again, this worksheet that Yasmin shared and all of the articles that she mentioned are shared in the resource folder. You can check out that link in the chat. So Yasmin, through this activity and just through your study of Sayyid, what do you think is most important for teachers and students to take away from a study of his life and experience?
So I think if you're doing an activity similar to the one that I just outlined, a little bit different from what Carl outlined, was actually looking at Sayyid's work. If we're looking at narratives about Sayyid, I think the most important thing to think about is just sort of like who is writing and reading these newspapers. Just in terms of like what are the stakes involved in people who took an interest in his life during his lifetime. And I think that could also be really helpful potentially for students to think about, you know, reading sources today even, and the kind of like who's involved in kind of producing the media that we consume, what are the power dynamics, who are the stakeholders.
Great, thanks Yasmin, and hopefully we'll have time to get to more questions for you after our last presentation. So I am pleased to introduce our last speaker, Brian Rush, last but not least. Brian Rush is a first-year PhD student in Duke's Art History program, and he is focusing on urban planning and architecture in the Middle East using digital humanities techniques. Brian took a special interest in the Arab and Islamic world's connections to Africa and worked with a professor at Duke on working to translate some of Sayyid's writings. And so we're really thrilled to have Brian here today, who will actually show a really engaging kind of presentation and trajectory of Sayyid's life and what we know from his writings. Thanks so much, Brian.
Of course. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting. I'd like to thank the organizers of this, the previous presenters, which provide some absolutely amazing context. And yeah, I've been working with Professor Lo here at Duke for the past 1.5 years, as well as taking the course that Yasmin mentioned, working with Yasmin, and under Dr. Carl Ernst as well on this project. And so let me get my screen shared real quick. All right. Can everybody see it?
Yep.
Perfect. So as we were working with these texts in the class, I started asking myself this question about where was Omar? How do we kind of place him historically? And there kept arising a couple of questions in regards to like what exactly are the citations that are coming forward in terms of particular locations. So as this started to develop, I started using some of my mapping techniques I've learned in art history and through digital humanities, and started kind of plotting these locations on a map. So I'm going to walk you through some of his autobiography, the primary section that discusses his life and his time until he reaches the Owens. So we'll start here. So he says, "My name is Omar ibn Said. My birthplace is Futa Toro between the 2 rivers. I sought knowledge in Bundu and Futa, and Sheikh was called Muhammad Sayyid, my brother, and Sheikh Suleiman Kimbe, and Sheikh Jibril Abdul. I continued seeking knowledge for 25 years. I came back home for 6 years. Then there came to our country a large army who killed many people and brought me to the big sea and sold me into the hands of a Christian, a white person, who bound me and sent me on board of the big ship in the big sea. So in this lower map here, if you guys can see my pointer, this green area is Futa Toro, and this top map up here shows modern geopolitical borders. And so Futa Toro rests in what is currently northern Senegal. And so you see the rivers here. So Omar would have been born in this region right around here. We don't know exactly where or what city he was born in, and he only makes passing reference to his mother's name. And so it's very hard to find any further details beyond these details that he provides here. Now, this region, he would have spoken a local language, more than likely Fulani, possibly Wolof, and then the Futa Toran tribe. There was a strong influence of Islam and Arabic from the north, coming from Morocco with Sufism and with the Islamic education that Dr. Carl Ernst has been talking about. And so he was one of these kind of religious scholar elites who lived in this region, having studied in the system for 25 years, and then even more than likely taught. Now, we can also see the city St. Louis on the coast. That was the primary French port that they had set up on the river system so that they could travel into the interior and take advantage, start wars between different tribes, and ultimately take these people who were capture them from these prisoners of war, and then eventually ship them to the Americas. So moving on, he says, we sailed upon the Great Sea a month and a half when we came to a place called Charleston in the Christian language. And so Charleston sat inside this bay, but with many other tributaries coming out. And Charleston at the time would have been a very sizable city for the South in particular, because there was such a significant slave trade occurring here with such powerful and rich plantations. And so the slave ship that Naomi actually mentioned earlier, the Heart of Oak, we believe actually was the ship that carried Omar ibn Said. As we found, this is the ad that's readily available online that says the sale of the Heart of Oak's cargo, consisting of 300 prime windward coast slaves of the Mandingo and Fula nation, will commence tomorrow at the stores on the south end of Gadsden Wharf, and that would be January 4th, 1808. And as Dr. Carl Ernst said, it was in the beginning of 1808, a law went into effect against the importation of slaves. Now, shipments of enslaved peoples did continue illegally, but this January 4th of 1808 could possibly have been the very last slave ship that would have legally entered Charleston's harbor. And knowing that Omar came over in the last months of 1807 and that he was of the Fula nation, all the signs point to this being the very ship. And now part of this project is locating exactly where these sites are. So I've located Gadsden Wharf as this left purple-pink block on the side of Charleston. Now this site is very changed today, but that's often where slave ships would come in and right off the block begin selling the enslaved peoples that were in their cargo. After this law went into effect, it was the customs exchange, this little purple block to the right, where local slave auctions would occur and the shipments were moved because there was no longer ships coming in, but it was purely based upon who was bringing slaves into the city. And so this customs house is still in existence and is preserved as a museum. Now we move on into looking at the entire set of map here that they've detailed all the plantations that are around. And so in 1820, an extremely detailed set of county maps were put together by the South Carolina government that detail every single plantation at the time. And so using this, I was able to find exactly where Johnson, this little thing just, okay, oh my gosh, go back. Where Omar says, there they sold me to a small, weak and wicked man called Johnson, a complete infidel who had no fear of God at all. So we can locate him as you can see here, just upriver from Charleston proper. And from other stories about this plantation and about this site, we can easily gather that this was a rice plantation that Johnson was running. And so locating it in a modern map, we see that it's actually in a current naval weapons station. And kind of ironically, this plantation, this former plantation, is now called the Plantation Golf Course on this military base. So here's just kind of a zooming out of what Omar's life ended up in the US, ended up pertaining to. So down to the south, we see Charleston with a county map. He then escapes upwards, northwards into North Carolina, and being captured just outside of Fayetteville. This church right here, all these purple dots are churches. The green are plantations. The blue is rivers, or the green is swamps, not plantations. My apologies. And so Charleston was down here. He escaped to Fayetteville and was caught out of a church outside of Fayetteville, which we can speculate was this right here. It aligns with many of the distances that he describes, as well as it being a church that was actually on the decline at the time in 1810 when Omar would have been escaping after 2 years. And then Wilmington. So after a month, I came to a place called Fayetteville, and we have a map of 1825 Fayetteville. And here I continued in a great house, which they called in the Christian language, they called jail, 16 days and nights. And so we've been able to locate that jail in the north of Fayetteville, right up here, as well as the Presbyterian church, which was said that he went to every day after converting in 1829. And so that very same church, the church that he would go to every week was just 2 blocks from the jail, which he had previously been imprisoned in, and as Yasmin was discussing, have written on the walls to garner kind of this reputation amongst the community. And a man called Bob Mumford took me and led me out of the jail, and I was very well pleased to go with them to their place, and I stayed at the Mumfords for 4 days and nights. Now, we don't know where the Mumfords exactly lived, but there was a street in the south of Fayetteville called Mumford Street. And doing some archival research, Bob Mumford was the sheriff of the town at the time. His father was the sheriff before him as well. So the Mumfords were one of the original founders of Fayetteville in the 1700s. And we're kind of a mainstay in the legal system at the time. And so for him to kind of take this extrajudicial stance where he was actually able to take Omar out of the prison because of this kind of reputation of an exceptional slave who could read and write, kind of for his own family's purposes. And so then we get to Bladen County. And so what ends up happening is that Bob Mumford, his daughter is Betsy Mumford, who was the wife of James Owen, who would eventually purchase Omar. And so the Owens lived on 2 plantations in Bladen County. Their exact lines are very hard to establish, but Omar says, I went to live with them and have remained in the place of Jim Owen until now. And so there's Owen Hill to the south and Milton Plantation to the north on either side of the Cape Fear River. It is actually in Owen Plantation where Omar was buried. And Dr. Carl Ernst mentioned his grave. I've tried to go find his grave. I went to the brick box that they show when you look for these graves. The brick box is actually the foundation of a modern house. I don't know why that's associated with the graveyard, but doing some further archival research, there are statements saying that his grave is actually in the middle of the woods behind a trailer park at the back end, close to the Cape Fear River. And as Dr. Carl Ernst mentioned, he was originally buried with James and Betsy Owen, but they were moved to Wilmington, and it's either speculated that his gravestone was desecrated so that there was no record that the family kept such close ties with an African, or that, as Carl Ernst said, was taken by somebody. But it is no longer marked.
Brian, so sorry to interrupt. I just want to give you about a 5-minute warning.
Perfect, thank you so much. And so there's approximate plantation marks on the where it would be in Bladen County. And so this is just some of the other work we can kind of speed through this. This is one of Omar's documents, and between Omar's documents and family documents as well, we can begin to piece together exactly what the Owen family tree was as well, who he was interacting with, and then the kind of trajectory of the family. And so at this point, we've built all the way up into the modern day of the descendants of the Owens, very few of which still live in North Carolina or Bladen County. And so Fayetteville was burned to the ground in 1831. And so there was a shift, and none of those original buildings survive. But during this period as well, the James Owen and his family moved more so into being prominent members in the Wilmington community, more so than in Fayetteville, still holding the plantation in Bladen County. But they owned a house that was on First Street, right in the front of Wilmington, as well as being prominent members of the Presbyterian Church, which was less than a block from their house. And this is a former Presbyterian church, and that's the street front where they would have been, where the Owens once would have stayed, is now totally commercial and no longer residential. So the original houses no longer remain. However, doing some archival research, unfortunately, it's not in this PowerPoint, but they've done sketches of these houses, and there's some family remembrance and oral histories that have been written down in regards to their times in Wilmington as well. And so just kind of to give some background on the methodology, here's the kind of a collection of the several different maps that I was using and to creation of layers, locating the cities, trying to figure out where exactly Omar could have like been and where the family could have taken him as well. And so there's other references to people who have some of his documents originally in places such as north of Charlotte at this very large plantation that was eventually turned into the spring destination. And so the Owens were very involved in the railroad industry as well as regular travelers to these healing springs, which were a very popular pastime in the 1800s and early 1900s. And so many of these spring residents, both people who lived at the springs themselves and visited them, became friends of the Owens and then inherited to some extent these documents that Omar written. And so there's speculation that Omar could have gone to this eupectic springs there, or even to one in Virginia. So you start to put these layers and kind of bring Omar's life into focus. Like what was the physical landscape that Omar existed in, with churches, with roads, with the rivers, the transportation systems of railroads, the plantations that existed. And you start to bring what his life, outside of speculation, outside of this kind of folklore, this folk character, like Yasmin was discussing, that turned into the justification and slavery apologists, into what we still live in today. So, and I do want to say, I have also provided some material for your students that should be in the package of resources that is very similar to this. It follows his autobiography line by line, and then providing a lot of background information, some further research, and then some comprehensive questions as well that I hope you'll be able to use. So I'll go ahead and open it up to questions now.
Thank you so much, Brian. And it's really fascinating to see how you've used his autobiography, and thank you for reading lines from his autobiography in your presentation. The translation of his autobiography is available freely online, and we have included a link to that your students can read in the resources. And as Brian mentioned, he's also prepared a packet for students to use that really helps narrate his life and traces his movement and why he was moving throughout his lifetime. So Brian, thank you again so much for preparing that. I'll ask all of our panelists to go ahead and actually turn on their cameras. In the interest of time, we'll take just a few final questions. So if Naomi and Dr. Ernst, if you could also turn on your cameras and join us for our last Q&A bit here. We have so many wonderful questions, and unfortunately we won't get to answer them all, but I'd like to pose kind of an encompassing and reflective question that will kind of help summarize, I think, all of your presentations together. And that is, if you can comment on the importance of teaching hard history, like incorporating the narratives of enslaved peoples into our understanding of American history. And further, what is the contemporary relevance of a study of Sayyid in terms of thinking about racism and Islamophobia? So if you all want to kind of comment on the contemporary relevance and why teaching about hard history is important, feel free to unmute yourselves and chime in.
This is a very important moment for that question, Emma. I think that most people are aware that we're starting to open up questions about the early history of America in a way that has never really happened before. And the role of slavery in that was undeniable. And so we need to have a reckoning with that and to acknowledge what actually happened. And this is our history. So we have to be unflinching and honest. And I think that's the best way to proceed.
I agree with Dr. Ernst. I agree with Dr. Ernst. Very important. Good timing, this presentation. And it's inclusive. It helps those who are in the classroom, who are Muslim, who may be of African ancestry, to feel a sense of inclusiveness, not so much just teaching that, well, it can give you a different view, that those who were enslaved were people who came with a knowledge of themselves, with traditions, with the culture, with language, intellectually astute. It gives a different view around the concept of slavery and who was involved. So yes, this is very important.
And there's something really valuable about handling original documents of history. They're not eloquent necessarily, but you realize these are the bricks out of which historians build the towers of their interpretations of history. And I'll just give you one example. I've gotten from the Southern Historical Collection at UNC the papers of the Owen family, which include land deals, bills of sale for slaves. And among other things that we just learned in my class is that John Owen, the governor, in 1828, he was a graduate. He went to study at UNC. He was the president of the board of trustees of the university. And he also purchased a slave. He purchased an enslaved person from Hinton James, who was the first student to enroll at UNC in 1795. So these slavery connections go all the way back to the beginning. And when you see that in black and white on the paper of the documents, it's kind of unforgettable.
Thank you, thank you. And Yasmin or Brian, do you want to address the question and thinking about the contemporary relevance and thinking about Sayyid's life and experiences in terms of racism and Islamophobia?
Yeah, I mean, that was wonderful. I don't have too much to add, honestly, to Carl and Naomi, but one thing I could definitely say is that I think it also just helps to kind of complicate the way that or at least the way that I was taught American history in high school, in terms of thinking about a sort of depth of complexity and diversity of narratives that has always been there. That's not new. That's just a matter of kind of where we're looking and how we kind of compose our archives. Even just thinking about, you know, more standard texts maybe that we grew up reading, like Frederick Douglass's autobiography, which is incredibly, you know, kind of powerful, but then thinking about the fact that American history has always been multilingual, and that there are different types of narratives of people who were enslaved that we can also learn from, that kind of complicate some of the assumptions that we might have grown up with.
No, please.
Well, I was just going to say, we need new textbooks. So those young people who are sitting here in this narrative, we need new textbooks, and we need to have some influence on these textbook commissions, those groups that are making decisions as to which textbooks will be used in the classroom. And then the narrative needs to be changed. This is history, American history, even world history. So it needs to be woven into what is called the master narrative. So it's not seen as a sliver of information in the margins of a textbook. So we need really to have new textbooks. So that's a challenge to all you young folks that are sitting here in this program.
Thank you, Naomi. And for those of you who are not able to get new textbooks, we have prepared a document of additional resources and a Google Drive folder where our presenters' materials and Yasmin and Brian's activities that they've prepared for your students to use are helpful in bringing these these important narratives that are not reflected in your textbooks. We hope that these resources are a way for you all to accomplish that. Brian, did you have any last thoughts?
No, no. I mean, I was just going to kind of. I'm trapped by the idea of physicality within all of this, and so it's just the idea that not only are the narratives important, but it's realizing that like this isn't some long lost history. These are the buildings and the spaces, and these are the legacies that we're interacting with to this day. And so too often things can just kind of be like, oh, that's the past. But no, we're living in these spaces. We're living with the consequences of this. And so bringing it into the real is so important in all of this. And for the narratives to not even be spoken about, but to bring it into the real on top of bringing it to light.
Well, thank you so much all for your time. With that, we are actually at the end of our hour-and-a-half webinar this evening, and so we are going to head and close and apologize that we didn't get to all of your questions, but we will be sending a follow-up email with information about the recording of this webinar, as well as where to find additional information if you're interested in exploring on your own. So on behalf of the sponsors, the North Carolina Museum of History, Carolina K-12, and the Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies at UNC, we thank you all again for joining us this evening and give special thanks to the Breitmeyer Foundation for funding this Teaching Hard History series. And we thank you all and applaud you for the incredible work that you're doing in your classrooms to teach this history amid many unforeseen challenges, even as you adapt to teach virtually, in hybrid or in-person settings. The next event in this Teaching Hard History series is November 10th at 5 p.m. and it's entitled Rifles, Radio, and Resistance, Robert F. Williams and the Black Freedom Movement. And we hope to see you there, and we will send you the registration information about this webinar, as well as the follow-up information from this program in an email. So with that, we'll close, and thank you again for all being here.